It's been described as a chilling crime, the stabbing murder of Neutral Bay businessman Morgan Huxley.
Morgan doesn't follow the rules. He's a character, unlike any other. The comic relief, always joking, making friends and family smile and laugh. At 1:28, Morgan is caught on hotel surveillance cameras, stepping out onto Ben Boyd Road and walking towards Military Road. Morgan has piqued his interest, and Jack watches him. And as he watches him, something in him stirs. You see, Jack has a long-held fantasy of which he has rarely spoken, at least not to any of his friends or work colleagues. Is this the moment where the urge to carry out this fantasy suddenly strikes? Morgan may be bigger than Jack, in both weight and stature, but his defences are down, thanks to the alcohol. And Jack is ready, sober, alert, breaking into a rapid walk, almost a jog, behind him. He closes the gap. He's carrying a blue Phillips Fox bag slung over his right shoulder, in which he's had a large Japanese steel kitchen knife. And this is important, because this fantasy of his involves following home a stranger, a total random, and then stabbing this random stranger to death. Hey folks, welcome to A Crime Square. If you're new here, I'm NJ. If you're not, well, welcome back. In today's episode, we're tackling the baby-faced killer, the murder of Morgan Huxley. It was written by Sharon Hough, so thank you so much, Sharon. This is one of those cases where I get to say, see, queer folks can be messed up too. For this episode, we're going down under to the city of Sydney, where there is yet another thing in Australia that can kill you. But in all seriousness, when I first heard about this case, it left me speechless. But once we properly got into the research, it proved so much more shocking than I initially realized. First, a bit of housekeeping before we get going. Why not hit that subscribe button, seeing as you're here. And feel free to sound off in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. If you're here for the live premiere, I'm over in the chat. Come and join me there. But I think we've had enough housekeeping. Let's dive in, shall we?
A Crime Most Queer is an LGBTQ true crime podcast intended for adult audiences and may contain graphic or disturbing content, including detailed descriptions of violence, physical or sexual assault, injuries to victims, and foul language. If you feel this may trigger you at all, please reconsider listening.
Prologue. 000, police, fire or ambulance. It's early morning on the 8th of September 2013 when Jean Redmond, a 24-year-old Irish physiotherapist, opens her eyes and looks over at the clock next to her bed. The digital clock face reads just after 1:30, and as her eyes adjust to the gloom, she realizes what woke her. There's a knocking at the front door. She knows her flatmate, 31-year-old Morgan Huxley, has been out for the evening to celebrate his best friend's engagement, and assumes that it's one of his friends. Her boyfriend is supposed to be coming over after his work shift, but it's too early for him. She gets up, closes her bedroom door, returns to bed, and grabs her headphones. She presses them into her ears and turns on some music to lull her back to sleep. An hour later, she is roused from her slumber once more. There are strange noises coming from the next room next to hers. Morgan's room. She is instantly annoyed. Morgan should have known better. Just because he went out for a night of partying doesn't give him the right to make a racket in the middle of the night. She swings her legs off the bed and gets up, determined to give him a piece of her mind. Surely, whatever's going on in the next room can be kept a little quieter. Consideration for others isn't too much to ask. As she approaches Morgan's bedroom door, an uneasy feeling comes over her. The door is ajar, which is unusual, and when she apprehensively pushes it open, her mind cannot comprehend what she's seeing. Morgan is lying at his bedroom door in a pool of blood, naked from the waist down, his breath a mix of gurgling and gasps. She screams his name and drops to her knees. Realizing that she doesn't have a phone, she runs back to her bedroom, scoops it up off her bed and dashes back. While she tries to stem the bleeding, she simultaneously tries to contact emergency services. But in her haste, she dials the wrong emergency number for Australia. As panic sets in, she racks her brain for Sydney's emergency number, but panic renders her memory useless. She decides instead to call her boyfriend, Ertan Ukar, and ask him to send an ambulance to her home. Her mind is swimming. Who could have hated this amazing, friendly, sweet, fun man like this? She draws a blank, which allows a million other questions to race into her mind. She has to save him. What more can she do before the paramedics arrive? Suddenly, her phone rings. It's emergency services, and they start to walk her through life-saving procedures. When Ertan arrives, she barely acknowledges him, and he just goes downstairs to wait for the first responders. Eventually, she hears the sound of sirens approaching, and the first responders soon charge through the door. As she stands off to the side, watching the medics fight to keep Morgan alive, a million thoughts rush through her head. When police officers try to ask her questions, she can barely think straight. And as Morgan is moved onto a gurney and loaded into an ambulance, all she can do is cry. Chapter 1. I love you, Mum. Many parents may argue that their children are normal. But to be honest, what's normal really? They are 100% their own person, whether they fit in or not. They have their own agendas, opinions, quirks, habits, likes and dislikes, the last of which is where the most uncomfortable moments come for a mom and dad when at family functions or trying to impress guests. But Morgan Charles Frederick Huxley wasn't interested in this and took it to another level. When he was a young boy, he'd clear the tables of other kids' dirty dishes at daycare and take them to the kitchen. He would do this in restaurants too, much to the amusement of other patrons. Morgan doesn't follow the rules. He's a character, unlike any other, the comic relief, always joking, making friends and family smile and laugh. In the wake of his passing, he is described as always being such a positive, fun influence on everybody. In his teens, he decided that wearing a suit and tie in a stuffy office just wasn't for him, and he wanted to follow his passion for life on the water. So passionate was he that his mom bought him his first tinny, a mass-produced aluminium runaround boat with real wheels, so he could easily push it into the water. He went into study for a year doing ocean engineering at TAFE in Launceston, Tasmania. Years later, he would take his parents out in his boat for a joyride in the bay to see the Queen Mary 2, and was warned off by the tugs for getting too close to the other boats. He just laughed and veered off, racing off at speed. His older brother Oliver and sister Tiffany are both graphic designers. His mom, Dee, is a talented and admired children's book illustrator. And although Dee and her husband Alan split up when Morgan was in primary school, Morgan's childhood was a happy one. In his spare time, Morgan could be found playing soccer or tinkering with his car, and in 2009 he started his own business, Huxley Marine, based on Blackwattle Bay, primarily building jetties and boat sheds around nearby Balmain and Birch Grove. But he docked his boat in Neutral Bay, on the northern foreshores of Sydney Harbour. For those of you, like me, who have never been to Sydney, it's difficult to comprehend just how large an expanse of water Sydney Harbour truly is. The shoreline is a jagged collection of bays, inlets, coves and outcrops, and Neutral Bay is just one of these. But it has a storied past. Let's step back in time for a moment. When Captain Arthur Phillip of the Royal Navy set out for Australia in May 1787, he was instructed to establish a settlement in Botany Bay, a large bay on the west coast of the continent. However, when he arrived in January the following year, he found Botany Bay to be largely unsuitable, it lacked both secure anchorage and a reliable source of water. Departing the bay and travelling further north, he entered what is now Sydney Harbour and found a site that offered both fresh water in the form of Tank Stream and waters deep enough for ships to anchor close to shore. He named the site Sydney Cove in honour of the British Home Secretary, the 1st Baron, later Viscount Sydney, and it was here that he established the penal colony that Sydney is known for. It was near that site, 170 years later, that ground was broken for the iconic Sydney Opera House. To minimise the risk of convicts escaping by stowing away on outgoing ships, now Governor Phillip zoned different bays for different types of vessels. The harbour diagonally across from Sydney Cove was designated for foreign or neutral vessels, which is how Neutral Bay got its name. When Morgan wasn't toiling away at his trade, he could be found lazing on his boat in the secluded harbour in Neutral Bay. He was a hard worker, and his hard work seemed to be paying off, and he was confident that a big contract building an ocean walkway on the central coast would soon be his. Often, while on a job and waiting for low tide in order to gain access, he would pop in at his mom's home in Balmain, covered in dust and grime from the job site. Do you recall him spinning around and saying, "I love you, Mum," and then standing back and critiquing her work, before disappearing into the kitchen to clear out any scraps he could find in the fridge? Once Morgan asked his mom if she minded if he didn't become an artist, and she thought that was the best thing he could have decided on for a career. However, his mischief didn't stop at home. He always made fun of, in his opinion, difficult people, as in the occasion where he pulled his pants down and mooned or showed his bare ass to some business associates of John Giddens, the operator of Blackwattle Marine Operatives, where Morgan had his workshop as they were leaving the premises. Mr. Giddens gave evidence at the trial for Morgan's murder and said that he had disapproved of his antics and demanded his keys, but Morgan just laughed him off. I've often said of myself, when I die, don't lie at my funeral and claim that I was a joy to be around and lit up every room I entered, because we all know that is bullshit. But with Morgan, it genuinely appears that this wouldn't have been a lie. Sure, he pissed off his landlord with his antics, but I'm sure there were people whose personality clashed with his. But it seems like his passing most definitely left the world a slightly darker place. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Didn't Quite Fit In. Daniel Jack Kelsall was adopted by Lynn and Mark, a wealthy couple in Kandala, near Wellington in New Zealand, in a house overlooking Wellington Harbour. Despite being named Daniel, everybody uses his second name Jack. Lynn and Mark ran a successful real estate company in central Wellington before relocating to Sydney when Jack was a teen. The Kelsalls already had a boy when they adopted Jack, and they would later get a third child, a little girl. Jack is described by neighbours as an awkward, skinny, red-headed teenager and was known as the boy who didn't quite fit in. Although he was friendly and polite, he had a short fuse, with the former classmates saying that Jack had a temper, grew anxious very quickly, and would often lash out at fellow students. Another is quoted as saying, "Jack did this strange thing where he would go around asking for hugs." Basically, the general consensus was that Jack was odd. Very odd. Being the apples of their parents' eye, no expense was spared on their children's education, on their hobbies, summer holidays, and Jack and his siblings had every chance in life. Jack's parents enrolled him in a Montessori school, Athena College, described as an alternative school based on self-directed learning. Because his education took a different route to the public school system, he had interests dissimilar to the other children in the area. He was known for his obsession with video games, fiction novels, and the arts, and he took part in school cabaret performances. After he finished school, he attended World Tech, where he studied to be a chef. But then he relocated to Sydney to be with his family in 2011, where they settled down into a comfortable home in Sprucen Street in Neutral Bay. Jack soon secured a job as a contractor, working after hours as a kitchen hand at the Sydney Cooking School, across the road from the Oaks Hotel. Jack hadn't given up on his hopes of becoming a chef, but as we all know, you have to start somewhere, and you get your foot in the door wherever you can to achieve your goal. Fred Deverell, Jack's boss at the Sydney cooking school, would later tell a journalist from Fairfax Media that he was made aware of the fact before taking Jack on that he had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism that makes it difficult to communicate with others and communicate non-verbally. But they figured that, considering the job merely entailed after-hours cleaning, it was unlikely that he would have any interactions with the customers. So it wasn't seen as a concern, and he got the job. Morgan was possibly not unknown to Jack. He would frequent the bar at the Oaks Hotel, where Jack would go after work. He would stop in for coffee at the school's cafe, where Jack would sometimes be hosted. He lived just behind the school in Watson Lane, so he would frequent local takeaway stores close to the hotel, Crust Pizza, the Curry Place, and his favourite, the Noodle Star, which were equally convenient eateries for Jack to go. But the two had never spoken, not even once. Not that until that night. That fateful night, where the lives of Alan and Dee, and Oliver and Tiffany and Jean, and yes, Morgan too, would be changed forever. Well, they didn't speak that we know of.
Dreamstream, a place to create yourself. Record video, music, and podcasts in our full-service studio. Record video, music, and podcasts in our full-service studio. Dreamstream, a place to create yourself.
Chapter 3. No Shoes. Exactly how things played out for Morgan's final day are a bit of a mystery, although we do have a fair idea of what his movements were for most of that day. So, while I will try to be as accurate as possible here, what follows are the facts, but with a generous serving of deduction and supposition. It is a typically humid subtropical day on the 7th of September 2013 in Neutral Bay. It's election day in Australia, and people have spent the day going about doing their civic duty. Lazing on his boat, docked in the small harbour, Morgan Huxley is dressed in attire suited to the climate, a pair of cargo shorts and a t-shirt with sneakers lying clumsily discarded next to his seat. He voted earlier in the day, and now he is relaxing, allowing his mind to wander. Business has been slow of late, but he daydreams of the huge upcoming contract in his future. This new opportunity could be the big break he's been working so hard to catch. This could be the stepping stone to much bigger and better things. As the sun sinks slowly in the west, Morgan decides it's time to head home. He's been invited to 2 different election parties, one at his mom's and one at his sister's, but tonight is also his best friend's engagement. At long last, Chris Maroney has finally proposed to his long-term girlfriend, and that is absolutely cause for celebration. The evening promises to be a blast, and he needs to get ready. But once he gets home, he decides, screw it, it's casual. Then he decides to just stick with his current look. But he pulls on a pair of flip-flops, grabs the gift he bought for the happy couple, and the keys to his Ford Ute, a squat pickup truck, and heads for the door. When he arrives at Chris's parents' place in Lane Cove, he settles in, grabs a beer, sticks his shoes in a corner somewhere, and mingles, greeting friends and making introductions. He's more comfortable barefoot anyway, and this is a party. Little does he know that there is danger lurking, and this night will change so many lives forever. It is after midnight when Morgan shares a taxi with Chris and Philippa back to Neutral Bay. They've all had way too much to drink, and Morgan and Chris both decide, responsibly, that it's safer not to drive. But Morgan isn't in any hurry to head home yet. He suggests that the 3 of them go for one last drink, but when the other 2 decline the offer, Morgan decides, gonna go and party alone. The taxi pulls up in front of Morgan's flat and he gets out and then lifts his hand in a wave as the car pulls away. He's still barefoot, having left his shoes at Chris's parents' place, but he barely notices. He realizes, standing there on the sidewalk, that he is incredibly drunk. But no self-respecting Aussie would let that stand in the way of one last Frosty, and he knows that he will need to stop at an ATM and draw money on the way there. So he sets off in the direction of the Easy Mart on Military Road, and when he gets there, he heads straight for the cash machine. While he fumbles with the card and the ATM, he briefly exchanges words with a young man with curly ginger hair and glasses, who asks if he needs help. Morgan declines the offer and asks if the young man wants to use the machine. When the young man says no, he doesn't, they go their separate ways. Morgan makes his way up Military Road to his favourite bar at the Oaks Hotel, arriving shortly after 1 a.m. And the young man purchases licorice, his mother's favourite, and then too sets off in the direction of the Oaks Hotel. Morgan sits at a table near the door, and he calls his ex-girlfriend Jessica Hall. They've known each other since primary school, and they'd previously dated for a good many years. They'd actually had plans to meet up, but Morgan had cancelled, telling her that he was with Chris. He also phones other friends of his, strange enough, or ex-girlfriends, to find out if they want to join him, but they too turn him down, saying it's too late to go out now. Around this time, the waitress informs him that it's actually closing time, and he figures maybe it is time to go home after all. At 1:28, Morgan is caught on hotel surveillance cameras stepping out onto Ben Boyd Road and walking towards Military Road. But Morgan isn't the only one to make it to the CCTV footage. In his intoxicated state, Morgan fails to notice the young man standing nearby, watching him intently. The same young man who 20 minutes earlier stood behind Morgan in the Easy Mart as he tipsily tried to extract cash from the ATM machine. The same man who, unbeknown to Morgan, has given him the nickname No Shoes, as he watched Morgan enter the hotel bar. Morgan has piqued his interest, and Jack watches him. And as he watches him, something in him stirs. You see, Jack has a long-held fantasy of which he has rarely spoken, at least not to any of his friends or work colleagues. Is this the moment where the urge to carry out this fantasy suddenly strikes? Morgan may be bigger than Jack, in both weight and stature, but his defences are down, thanks to the alcohol, as he walks along Military Road. And Jack is ready, sober, alert. Breaking into a rapid walk, almost a jog, behind him, he closes the gap. He's carrying a blue Phillips Fox bag slung over his right shoulder, in which he has his chef's apron, a jacket, Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading cards, and a large Japanese steel kitchen knife. And this is important, because this fantasy of his involves following home a stranger, a total random, and then stabbing this random stranger to death. Morgan reaches the intersection and waits to cross, and he's joined by Jack mere moments later. It seems as if they exchange a few words and cross at the traffic light. As Morgan moves out of range of the CCTV cameras covering the front facades of the Oak Hotel and the other shops, Jack slows his pace slightly, allowing Morgan to pull ahead. The hunt is on. Chapter 4. The Wrong Random. As Morgan drunkenly makes his way home to the 2-story townhouse apartment that he rents with Jean, just 200 metres away from the Oaks Hotel, Jack stalks his prey. Maybe Jack already knows where Morgan lives, because just 6 months earlier, Morgan had told Chris that someone who he thought might be gay had followed him home. And that time, the young man had walked him to his door, and when Morgan opened the door, the young man had just walked in as if invited. Morgan shoved him back out and closed the door in his face. It was all very weird. This time, however, Morgan is less attentive, but Jack's attention is at its peak as he lurks outside Morgan's unit, deciding whether it is safe to go inside. When Morgan enters his flat, he's in two minds as to whether to go out again. He grabs a pair of sneakers from under the staircase and puts them on, before heading upstairs. But on entering his bedroom, he collapses onto his bed, fully clothed, and passes out. Around 1:30 a.m., Jack knocks on Morgan's front door, and then again, louder. This rouses Morgan's flatmate, Jean, but she decides it must be one of Morgan's friends, so she quietly gets up, closes her door, and relaxes back on her pillow. After still not getting any response from inside, Jack pulls his sleeve down over his hand and tries the door handle. To his surprise, he discovers that it's unlocked, and he cautiously pushes open the door and steps inside, quietly closing it behind him. Just as quietly, he reaches into his backpack and removes the knife. Jack stealthily makes his way up the stairs, following the sound of loud snoring. The first door is closed, but the second, from whence the snoring is coming, is slightly ajar. As the door swings open, he sees Morgan stretched out on his bed, face down. Like the predator he arguably is, Jack pounces on Morgan, stripping off his pants and exposing his, well, let's just say that shit went down that no straight man wants to experience from another dude. The indecent assault drags Morgan into consciousness, and on seeing a strange man in his bedroom with his hands on Morgan's junk, Morgan instantly reacts, trying to defend himself, and Jack, in turn, panics. Morgan clearly isn't as incapacitated as Jack had thought he was, and Jack's initial confidence melts away. Maybe he'd picked the wrong random. He grabs the chef knife and in a blind frenzy stabs Morgan over and over again, 28 times in total, seemingly oblivious to the blood flying everywhere. Jack plunges the knife into Morgan's back, neck and upper body. He severs the carotid artery, damages the jugular vein, and penetrates Morgan's lungs and head. Later, while conducting the post-mortem, the forensic pathologist would report finding a piece of steel, which resembled the tip of a sharp blade, embedded in Morgan's skull. It is all over in a flash. He is aware of the noises of gargling and panting from behind him, but Jack realizes that he needs to get the fuck out of there. He snatches up Morgan's phone, his bag, and the knife and runs out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and out of the apartment, tucking the knife into his shirt as he makes his escape. Contrary to how careful he had been on the way in, on the way out, he hadn't been as thorough about not leaving any incriminating evidence behind. But with adrenaline coursing through his veins, that was the last thing on Jack's mind. We will never know if Morgan knew that shit was going down, but we do know that he managed to get off the bed, stagger to the door as blood poured from his body, before finally collapsing and slipping into unconsciousness. Chapter 5. Why didn't she come earlier? It's 2:30 a.m. and Jean has just been woken by the unusual noises coming from Morgan's bedroom. She is instantly annoyed. Morgan should know better. Just because he went out for a night of partying doesn't give him the right to make a racket in the middle of the night. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight that greets her. Morgan on the floor of his bedroom in a massive pool of blood. She drops to her knees next to Morgan and vigorously shakes him, trying to wake him as she repeatedly calls his name, to no avail. She dashes back to her room to grab her phone, and in her panic she tries to dial the emergency number, which in Australia is 000. But she inadvertently dials 999, the emergency number for her home country of Ireland. She racks her brain for the right number, then gives up and calls her boyfriend Ertan, and hysterically screams into the phone, "Call an ambulance, now!" What she goes through that night will stay with her forever. Meanwhile, Jack flees the scene and disappears into the night. It's a 15-minute walk from Watson Street to his parents' home in Sprucen Street, and somewhere along the way, he switches off Morgan's phone and dumps it. He also dumps the knife. Neither item will ever be found. Somewhere in the distance, police and ambulance sirens pierce the night, but we'll never know if Jack heard them as he made his way home, whether he took pleasure in knowing that first responders were racing to the scene because of what he had done. What we know is that he went about his life, with not a care in the world. When Ertan arrives, he finds Jean administering CPR at the direction of the emergency operator. Morgan is naked from the waist down, and Ertan grabs a towel, placing over Morgan's genitalia to provide the gravely injured man a modicum of dignity. He then goes downstairs to wait for emergency services. At 3:05, an ambulance screeches to a halt in front of this unassuming apartment complex on this quiet street in this affluent suburb on the northern banks of Sydney Harbour. Paramedics stream through the front door of Morgan's flat and head in the direction of the room indicated by the gobsmacked young man who greeted them at the doorway and clearly unable to comprehend what he'd just seen inside the apartment. Upstairs, a distraught young woman is desperately trying to keep her friend alive, and the paramedics quickly take over, attending to the wounded man on the floor. Police officers arrive shortly thereafter, and they take Jean aside to get her version of events, but she is a mess, and all she can do is cry. Realizing that Morgan's condition is more dire than can be attended to in the field, the paramedics rush Morgan into the ambulance and speed off to the hospital. But despite their best efforts, Morgan passes away en route to the emergency department at Royal North Shore Hospital. Detectives are notified that the senseless, vicious attack is no longer just an assault, but now also a homicide investigation. Detective Sergeant Mark Dukes and his partner, Detective Senior Constable Kelsey Priestley, are assigned to the case. The next morning, the people of Neutral Bay wake up to the shocking news that 31-year-old Morgan Huxley has been murdered in their suburb, and the call goes out for anyone with information that could assist the police to please contact their nearest police station. Foot patrols are sent to businesses located around the Oaks Hotel to try and identify eyewitnesses and inquire about CCTV recordings. Footage from 7 different cameras is obtained, and police are able to track Morgan as he leaves the Oaks at around 1:30 and makes his way along Ben Boyd Road. More importantly, they notice a young man that Morgan had missed. Following almost at a jog, as if trying to catch up with Morgan, the two men eventually meet up at the intersection where they exchange a few words as they wait for the light to change. Then, when the light turns green, Morgan continues on his way. The young man follows, but now at a considerably slower pace, allowing a slight distance to open up between them. Unfortunately, when Morgan turns to walk up Military Road and the young man follows suit, they move out of range of the cameras, and there is no way to tell if the man followed Morgan all the way to and then into his apartment building. Their promising lead has gone cold, and they can't clearly identify the second man. Investigators are at a loss, and once again they send out foot patrol officers to see if they have missed anything. All they have to go on is that he is wearing chef's pants, a dark shirt, and was carrying a backpack. Officers go from restaurant to restaurant all along Military Road, asking if owners and staff can identify the man in the blurry still photograph pulled from the Oaks CCTV footage. But it never occurs to them to venture inside the Sydney cooking school. Why would they? No aspiring trainee chef would be at the school at 1:30 in the morning. However, a few days after the murder, as officers are once again pounding the pavement of Military Road, a barista from the cafe in front of the cooking school goes out and asks who or what police are looking for. When they show him the image taken from the CCTV footage, they finally catch a break. Upon speaking to the owner, Brett Deverell, Detectives Dukes and Priestley have a name: Daniel Jack Kelsel, a cleaner and prep assistant employed by the school because he had previous kitchen experience, including knife skills, and was therefore more qualified than a newbie. Brett says that Jack is very quiet, even-tempered and pleasant, so for them to suspect him of any wrongdoing is perhaps misaligned. But be that as it may, the detectives would still like to have a word with young Mr. Kelsel, and Brett gives them his contact details. Jack is just one of many suspects in the case, but hardened investigators like Dukes and Priestley know to follow every promising lead wherever it may, lead. And Jack Kelsel is a lead that could be quite promising. A call is made, and the following morning, police turn up at Jack's parents' home to ask Jack some questions and have a look around to see if they spot anything suspicious. They inquire of Jack whether he owns any knives, and Jack is the very definition of helpfulness, showing the officers his 2 decorative samurai swords on a stand near his bed and 2 large kitchen knives down in the kitchen. Frustratingly, none of them appeared to be a match for the blade tip found lodged in Morgan's skull. Jack agrees to accompany the detectives down to the North Sydney police station to provide a statement.
Time according to me is 6:41 p.m. on Tuesday, the 24th day of September 2013. I am Detective Senior Sergeant Mark Dukes from the Homicide Squad. For the purpose of this interview, can you just state your full name, date of birth, please?
Daniel Jack Kelsall, born on the 5th of February 1993.
Jack confirms that it is indeed him in the screen grab.
You know who that is?
It's me. Bring it, Jack.
But denies seeing anything untoward. He claims that he only knows from hearing it on the news that there has been a murder in Neutral Bay, and that he figures out from the coverage that it had been in the same area that he had been on the night in question. He walked behind some bloke, but he doesn't know who he was. He also denies all knowledge of any wrongdoing, or that he has ever been inside the victim's flat.
You ever been to his apartment?
That's that block of one of the blocks of apartments in
Correct. No? Never?
No.
He does subsequently admit that he and Morgan had exchanged a few words while waiting at the intersection, but says they hadn't walked together, claiming instead that he'd been on his way home and wanted to go past the school to make sure he turned the lights off.
Where you were over here on Bimboyd Road, and then you've indicated you'd sort of walk back up Military Road, across Watson. If you're cold, I'm just wondering why you would go that way. That doesn't look like the most direct route.
I don't know. I don't. When I get tired, I don't really pay attention to a lot of things. I think it was because I wanted to check in at work, the front of work.
Dukes asks Jack about the bag he's carrying, and he confirms that it is the bag seen in the video.
Did you have a bag with you?
Yes, this one.
Thank you. And it's that particular bag.
This one.
So that's a what is it? Phillips Fox with a, is it South Africa?
South African soccer team.
The World Cup.
That's, yes, I believe it's the Visa. So yeah, it's a World Cup. Leopard.
And do you recall what you would have had in that particular bag?
I would have had apron.
Yes.
My box of Yu-Gi-Oh trading cards.
Of your what? Sorry.
Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game. And that would be it. I might have had another food item, but I'm not too sure.
Duke's keen eye can't help but notice an unusual stain on the front, which intrigues him. But it is Jack's refusal to provide a DNA sample when asked that truly raises eyebrows. Eventually, with the interview having run its course, Jack's statement given and there being no just cause to detain him any further, the detectives tell him that he is free to go, reminding him not to leave the area, just in case they need any more questions answered. Then, 2 days later, Dukes receives an unexpected phone call. It's Jack, and he wants to amend what he previously said, telling the detectives that he hadn't entirely been truthful when last they spoke. Detective Dukes is all ears. Jack admits to having been inside Morgan's flat, and there's a good chance that his DNA would be present. This, he explains, is the reason for not wanting to provide a DNA sample. Dukes asks where he is, and Jack tells him that he is in a parking lot behind a grocery chain store in Neutral Bay. Dukes and Priestley waste no time in getting to the location, where Jack proceeds to spin them a yarn of fantastical proportions. According to Jack, While the two men stood at the traffic light, he had noticed that Morgan looked depressed, and Jack had offered to cheer him up a bit. Jack had then gone with Morgan to the flat in Watson Street, where they proceeded to have a consensual sexual encounter. After they were finished, Morgan fell asleep, and Jack quietly got dressed, grabbed his things, and let himself out. However, on his way out the building, a woman passed him in the walkway, and she looked to be in a rage. She burst past Jack and walked into Morgan's flat, and it was her, Jack posited, who had killed Morgan Huxley. Jukes asks why Jack didn't say anything earlier, and he claims to have been scared before turning on the waterworks. But Detective Jukes isn't buying it for a second, and he arrests Jack on suspicion of murder. With their prime suspect now in custody, they can finally get their DNA sample, and also take a closer look at that ominous stain on his bag. They also execute a search warrant on the Kelsall home, where they seize Jack's laptop, items of his clothing, and 2 kitchen knives. While the investigation continues, Jack is released and goes about his life, showing up for work at the cooking school, seeing a psychiatrist, and meeting up with a friend he met on a gay dating app a year earlier, whom he tells of someone having been murdered near his work, and that he's afraid to walk home. Meanwhile, forensic investigators are hard at work. They match Jack's DNA to that found on Morgan's penis. They match his fingerprints to those found on Morgan's door. And the stain on the backpack? Yep, you guessed it. Blood. Morgan's blood. Jack had attempted to wash it off, but he didn't do a very good job. Surprise, surprise. A search of his laptop turned up graphic images of human autopsies and computer-generated child porn. Detective Jukes and Priestley aren't sitting on their hands either. They interviewed Jack's GP, Dr. Susan Allman, and she tells them of a consultation where Jack had admitted to what he called intrusive thoughts of stabbing someone to death on his way home from work one night. He also told his psychiatrist, Dr. Matthew Bolton, "I've thought of killing someone else for the thrill of it. It sounds psychopathic. No idea why. Going to jail would depend on whether I wanted to get caught. It would probably be a total random, with a knife. I could hide the body." At the Sydney cooking school one afternoon, Brett Deverill asked Jack straight out if he did it. Jack looks at his boss, dead in the eye, perhaps for a moment longer than is comfortable, before finally saying that no, he didn't do it, then adding that if he had, there was no way they would catch him. Brett finds the exchange a little creepy, but chalks it up to Jack's love of forensic investigation dramas on TV, like CSI. But little does Jack know that he isn't as smart as he thinks. It's been a month to the day since Jean tried in vain to save her friend's life. But the cops finally have their guy. On the 8th of October 2013, Jack Daniel Kelsall is formally arrested and charged with the murder of Morgan Huxley. Chapter 6. The North Shore Casanova. Before we get to the trial, I want to discuss the media coverage of this case. As you may be aware, Australia is the home country of one Rupert Murdoch, the media mogul behind such bastions of journalistic integrity as the UK's now defunct tabloid News of the World, which was bust for hacking the phones of murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler, relatives of deceased British soldiers, and victims of the July 7, 2005 London bombings, bribing police officers, and exercising improper influence in the pursuit of stories, and the poster child of right-wing borderline fascist propaganda, Fox News. The bullshit peddled by publications owned by Murdoch's News Corp, but in particular the Herald Sun and the Daily Telegraph, was so salacious and tasteless and almost entirely fabricated, so much so that the American Broadcasting Corporation's Media Watch, touted it as Australia's leading forum for media analysis and comment, even did a segment on the coverage, where host Paul Berry picked apart the headlines, like "Housemate's death trauma, grisly scene inside Neutral Bay murder apartment," "Spurned lover, a murder suspect," Homicide detectives said a female killer was the strongest line of investigation. He was very popular with the ladies. Ladies' man murder. Morgan was killed by a woman, says ex-lover. And loved to death. Exclusive. Up to 14 women quizzed over murder. When it turned out that Morgan wasn't taken out by one of his many, many, many female lovers, if the tabloids are to be believed, the media went to town on the scrumptious new scandal. Ladies' man murder, twist. Gay neighbour charged with killing Morgan Huxley. In the shadows, exclusive, accused killer watched victim from lane. All Morgan's friends and family could do was watch in horror as the memory of their beloved son, brother, mate was besmirched by the lowest of low lives in the Australian press. They tried to see the funny side with his best friend, Chris Marais, who was the last of Morgan's friends to see him alive. Said in an interview with Greg Callaghan of the Sydney Morning Herald that Morgan would have laughed his head off at the insinuations that he was a player. He'd only had 3 serious relationships. As he said, he's never deliberately hurt anyone. He was always respectful of women. The lies and distortions in the media were relentless. But it wasn't only Morgan's good name being dragged through the mud. The press was risking tainting the jury pool with their baseless accusations and sensationalized headlines. And Jack's lawyer even pointed this out in court, as reported by ABC News Online. Jack Daniel Kelsel's lawyer blasts media over coverage of Sydney man Morgan Huxley's murder. He said, quote, "There's been a great deal of interference and undue speculation," end quote. Mr. Breton, said Kelsel, is entitled to the presumption of innocence and the media should respect his family's privacy. Rupert Murdoch appears to agree. In a now deleted tweet from the 13th of October 2013, back when we could still tweet, relating to the News of the World phone hacking trial in London that was about to get underway. He said, "Remember, everyone's innocent until proven guilty, entitled to fair trial in most countries." But maybe he only thinks that when the trial involves people currently or formerly in his employ. As for his publications, well, they're apparently all out of fucks to give. When asked by Media Watch for a response to these comments made by Melbourne University media law expert Jason Boslin, the Daily Telegraph article clearly creates an adverse impression of the accused. Although the article has been published well before the trial, the Daily Telegraph is entering dangerous territory in legal terms. The response from Trevor Seymour, the managing editor of the Daily Telegraph, spoke volumes for something that was just 9 words long. The Daily Telegraph stands by its coverage and its reporters. If you want to watch the full Media Watch segment, there is a link in the description. Chapter 7. What a tangled web we weave. On Monday, the 16th of March 2015, Jack Daniel Kelsel appeared before the Supreme Court of New South Wales, sitting in the old colonial Grecian-style building, the Darlinghurst Courthouse in inner Sydney. For many, it is difficult to reconcile the meek, mild-mannered young man with no criminal record or history of violence and the horrific crime for which he stands accused. To those who know him, he is polite, calm, reliable, albeit a tad odd. Not someone capable of committing a crime so heinous. The trial is the topic of conversation on everybody's lips, in bars and salons, at checkout counters and on buses, driven in large part by the media coverage, which, as we've already discussed, is relentless in squeezing out every last juicy drop and spewing it across their pages. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom is packed to bursting with Morgan's friends and family. Jack's parents, Mark and Lynn, are also in the public gallery to witness their son's fate. Jack sits in the dock, expressionless, as each member of Morgan's family addresses the court and tells of the devastation his crime has brought to their lives. The agony of losing Morgan is etched onto the face of each and every person in that courtroom who knew him. Even those witnesses who the media had tried to paint as firm and fast adversaries, like John Giddens, his former landlord, testified that Morgan was likeable and charismatic. In Giddens' case, he stated that the reason his business relationship with Morgan had soured was over some of his less than professional antics, like the mooning of Morgan's business associates that I mentioned back at the start. After sitting in the dock, as 2 weeks' worth of testimony from witnesses for the prosecution is heard, the day finally arrives to hear from the only witness to be called by the defence, Daniel Jack Kelsall himself, who adopts an air of calm while putting his ridicule of the system and disdain for the victim on full display. The jury never hears during the trial that Jack had previously changed his story, because the admission that he had made in the Woolworths parking lot hadn't been recorded and was therefore ruled inadmissible. They never heard that in the days following his initial interview with investigators, he had phoned Detective Jukes and admitted to being untruthful, that despite initially denying that he was ever in Morgan's apartment, he had in fact been invited in, and the two men had engaged in consensual sex. The jury heard none of this, and it afforded Jack an opportunity. Jack is smart, like smarter than 90% of Australians level smart. And actually, when this point is brought up in the trial, the smug smirk on Jack's face was kind of hard to miss. But he's smart, meaning that he is smart enough to know that Jukes wasn't sold on the story he'd been given in the parking lot. So when it comes time to put forward his version of events to the jury, his story changes again. In his testimony before the court, he claims that he and Morgan had struck up a conversation while waiting for the light to change. Morgan had appeared happy, but his smile had slipped, and he confessed to Jack that he had had a stressful week. Minutes later, he and Morgan were in Morgan's living room, and Jack was inquiring as to how Morgan relieved his stress. Jack then asked if Morgan would like to do things with him. Morgan agreed, and while they were busy fooling around, someone, or someones, entered Morgan's room and started attacking them. Jack freaked out and bolted from the flat, claiming that he had never got a good look at his attacker's face in his rush to get himself to safety, and he had no idea what happened after that. Let's be honest here. Any idiot with half a brain can see plain as day that this version of event has more holes than Swiss cheese, and clearly I'm exactly that kind of idiot, because wow, just fucking wow. For one, Morgan was naked from the waist down, so presumably, had shit gone down the way Jack claimed, Jack would have also been naked. Did he run out into the street with the family jewels flapping in the breeze? Where did he get dressed? And how did he find the time in his panicked escape to ensure that he grabbed his pants and underwear and shoes and bag and get the fuck out of there? Also, he said they were attacked. Where are his injuries? Where is the evidence of PTSD? His boss would later tell the media in an interview that Jack arrived at work a little more than 12 hours after Morgan had died and was his usual weird self, exhibiting no signs of trauma or disquiet. Like I said, fucking Swiss cheese. For someone who professionals proclaimed was some kind of super whiz kid, how stupid did he think his audience would be? Fortunately, the audience young Jack gets in the courtroom, the audience that matters, the judge and the jury, is not the audience young Jack probably would have liked to have had. Like Detective Jukes before him, the judge is also unconvinced. He too is of the opinion that Jack's story differs too much between his first interview and his courtroom testimony to be credible. But the defense barrister, Christopher Watson, SC, tries to play it down, saying that Jack is confused. Quote, "Please don't judge the accused on his appearance or manner. He is an introvert and has difficulty communicating." End quote. Such is Mr. Walton's request to the jury. He also reminds them of how the accused left licorice treats out for his mother before leaving for work. Quote, "Is that typical behaviour of a calculated killer?" End quote. In his closing arguments, the Crown Prosecutor, Pierre Marais, SC, puts forth that the reason why Jack didn't tell the entire truth was because he made it up on the fly after the fact. Despite the prosecution having to build its case on a lot of circumstantial evidence, the key is Jack's 2012 confession regarding his intrusive thoughts of committing a random kill. Looking the jury in the eye, Mr. McGrath sets out point by point each detail of the case against the 22-year-old, leaving but one thing left for the jury to infer. He urges the jury not to be distracted by red herrings. It is Morgan who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, not Jack. Quote, he has expressed intrusive, recurring and persistent thoughts about killing a total stranger with a knife on the way home from work, and admitting that he had taken a knife from work one night with the intention to stab someone with it, but luckily he did not meet anyone. End quote. Morgan Huxley was not so lucky, but some random who Jack had followed with exactly that intention. The indecent assault was opportunist. After the attack, he carried on his life as if nothing had happened, without an iota of remorse. He had not offered an excuse or explanation for his conduct, and evidence pointed to psychopathic traits. He continues, quote, despite the offender's youth and the terrible effects of imprisonment for life, the offence does fall within the worst case. End quote. He said he may look like a nerd, polite, docile, owlish, hiding behind glasses, but inside he is full of cold anger, just waiting for an opportunity to morph into something evil. Mr. McGrath concludes by telling the jury that, quote, the Crown case against the accused is straightforward and adds up. Based on all the evidence, it is obvious that this is not about sex. Mr. Huxley was heterosexual, whereas the accused is homosexual, something he did not hide. The truth is that the accused killed Huxley for no reason. End quote. Then looking directly at Jack, Mr. McGrath quotes the words of Sir Walter Scott. What a tangled web we weave, when first we practice to deceive. And with that, the Crown rests. In his summary, Judge Robert Allen Hume says that the decision to follow a stranger home and drive a knife into him more than 20 times is the work of a very disturbed mind. Quote, whether the offender killed for the thrill of it, or whether it was because of fantasy or obsession, I am unable to say. It was entirely senseless and needless. It must have been the doing of a very disturbed mind. Why he did it, only Kelsall knows. The jury adjourns to deliberate, and less than 3 hours later returns with their verdict, finding Jack Kelsey guilty on the count of indecent assault and murder of 31-year-old Morgan Huxley in the early hours of Sunday, the 8th of September, 2013. As the verdict is read out, Jack stands in the dock, his face completely blank. His mother and father, who have been there throughout the trial, look on and try to catch his attention, but not once does he meet their eyes. Meanwhile, from Morgan's family and friends, there are audible exclamations of gratitude and relief. Each member of Morgan's family is given an opportunity to deliver their impact statement before the court and describes what effect the senseless, heinous act has had on them. Morgan's mother, Dee, watched by Lynn Kelsall, said that she can't find the words to describe what it was like, quote, to be in the same room and be so close to the killer of my son, end quote. She adds that her son had been taken from her brutally and senselessly, quote, apparently for the thrill of it, end quote. Morgan's brother, Oliver, asks, quote, what for? Why did he take someone's life away? End quote. He tells the court that he's imagined in his mind his brother's final minutes, every second, blow by blow. The victim impact statement from Morgan's father, Alan Huxley, who suffers from multiple sclerosis, is read by a support person, in which he laments that his son had been taken away from him, and he doesn't know why. Quote, I will have to live the rest of my life never having an answer, end quote. Morgan's sister, Tiffany, reveals how traumatic the trial has been. Quote, my family and I had to sit there in silence as Morgan's killer told his calculated lies in court, end quote. Outside court, Morgan's ex-girlfriend, Jessica Hall, delivers an emotional speech on behalf of the Huxley family, noting that, quote, life has been stolen by a worthless psychopath. Morgan was an inspiring, generous, and loving young man who was beginning to make his way in the world. He had hopes and dreams, and he will never be able to realize. He will never get married, and will never be able to run around in a park with his children, end quote. She concludes with the words, "We love you, Morgan." A few weeks before his sentencing, Jack is analysed by a psychiatrist, Susan Pullman, at the Remand Centre in Silver Water. As a seasoned analyst, she had previously noted in an earlier assessment that Jack exhibits, quote, callous unemotional traits, end quote, and that he had even told one doctor that he doesn't get angry, he gets into a rage. In her final assessment, she reports, quote, his words are full of concern, but his eyes are cold, dangerous and angry. After all cases I've dealt with over the years, he unnerves me like no one ever before. He is a highly intelligent narcissist, end quote. So was it really a random kill? Or was it premeditated? Had Jack been watching Morgan, stalking him, fantasizing about the kill for months before he chose to strike? Who's to know? Daniel Jack Kelsall was sentenced to a maximum of 40 years in prison for the murder of Morgan Huxley. 4 months later, he was found guilty of possessing computer-generated child pornography, receiving an additional 6 months imprisonment. He is required to serve a non-parole period of at least 30 years and will not be eligible for parole until 2044. Epilogue. Final thoughts from the author. In this final chapter, I want to give the floor to my writer Sharon. So, while the voice is mine, the words are hers. Having researched this case and the people involved, one can't help but develop a bond, a kind of virtual connection to each one of them. Morgan Huxley was a confident, loud, happy-go-lucky young man, looking forward to a promising future, doing what he loved best. Drinking, partying, and running his own business, building boat sheds and all that goes with the sea, and relishing his freedom. He wrote his own rules and lived by them. He loved people and was very popular with friends and family alike. That boy in the class that everyone remembered years after leaving school. Even his former landlord expressed the opinion that he was someone who stood out, laughing and joking and pushing buttons if he felt like it. One just had to try and understand him. Jack Kelsall, on the other hand, had something eating him from the inside. He was not like other children. He was serious, quiet, and reserved, extremely intelligent, displaying not much of a sense of humour. Added to that, he was adopted, and the feeling of not belonging is a very real emotion. People are very quick to pass judgment for any unacceptable behaviour, because you never know what you're going to get or what genes they come from. As an adopted person myself, this is Sharon, not me, I know this for a fact. You don't know who you look like, what personality traits you've inherited, and in fact, you don't even know what time you were born. No matter how wonderful your adoptive family is, it's somewhere inside your head all the time, especially if the neighbours or extended family take pleasure in reminding you that you are adopted all the time. This is, of course, no excuse for being a murderer, but everyone reacts in different ways, and perhaps Jack's solution was to fantasize about being better or stronger than everyone else. The fact that he and his siblings were given everything they wanted and no cost was spared surely left a mark. This treatment is inclined to allow one to think that whatever you want or how you behave will carry no consequences. Maybe he did have a psychological glitch, but no one did anything about it. If a person admits to me that they were harbouring thoughts of committing a heinous crime like murder, I would not just think it would be something for a matter of record in a closed book. In my opinion, Jack should have been sent for further observation and assessment. Whatever the real story is, I feel that there are those who could have taken action and yet they didn't. They didn't take action before he became a very real threat. Whether they want to admit it or not, they collectively let Morgan and any other potential victim down by being indifferent and overlooking the glaring truth. Maybe Jack, in admitting his fantasies, was asking for help, but they never listened. And as such, he will not be remembered as the quiet, reliable kitchen hand, chef, actor, avid gamer, but instead as a murderer. As with Morgan Huxley, one just has to try and understand Jack Kelsall. This whole fiasco ended in two families being broken and living with unanswered questions, one life being stolen so early and the other life being destroyed so young. Very sad indeed. And that's our show. If you enjoyed today's video, how about you give us a like and a follow? And don't forget to hit the bell and get notified when we drop new videos. If you want to show your support, you can sign up as a monthly subscriber over on Patreon or give a once-off donation at Buy Me a Coffee. The links are both in the description. If you're a Patreon member, even a free member, you can join the community's chat where you can hang out and shoot the shit with me and other patrons. So come say hi. For those of you who prefer this in an audio-only format, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for A Crime Most Queer. I think that's about it for today. Once again, thanks again to Sharon for writing the script and the Dream Team for filming us, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.